think of myself as a triple threat, an astrologer, a writer, and a smartass. So this is one of these memes that I've co-opted for my own purpose. I don't always want company, but when I do, I prefer mutual reception. So let's define mutual reception, which is basically when two planets are each in a portion of the zodiac that is deemed to be an honored place for the other planet. So there are what we call major forms of reception. So let's first start with the general notion of place of honor, what is loosely called dignity in some circles. So for example, places of dignity can be a planet's own sign, where it is, lord and ruler, a planet's exaltation sign, where it is deemed to be, very strong as well too. You can have planets in their own triplicity, or their term or bound, or their face or decan. Now, as this slide shows, there are what we call major forms of reception, which are planets in signs occupied by each other, or the exaltation signs of each other. So signs of rulership or signs of exaltation are the major forms of reception. These other triplicities, term and bound, face and decan, I could get into explaining these, but if you're interested, they are discussed in a lot of detail in my book, Mutual Reception, and I'll leave it to those who are truly interested in that to maybe acquire the book and learn more about these minor forms of reception. In reality, we are very happy to deal with the major forms of reception only, and even among those two, sign ruled or sign in which exalted, even there's a hierarchy. None other than William Lilly had the final word on this, that said mutual reception between planets in signs of rulership is the most important of all, and is eminent above all others. Okay, so there are various forms of reception. There's what we call sort of pure reception, but there's also mixed reception. So, and I'm just going to dispense with these just for clarity. So mixed reception is when two planets are each in, a positive dignity of the other, but they're not in the same kind of class. Let me give you first an example of mutual reception by sign. So if Mars is in Taurus, a sign of Venus, while Venus is in Aries, a sign of Mars, there we have a very simple case of mutual reception by sign. In other words, Mars and Venus are each in each other's sign, the signs that they rule. So that's going to be the topic du jour, and the focus of our attention, because that's where it's easiest to interpret, and that's where we'll get the best bang for the buck. But there are these other forms of mixed reception. You can have, well, just to dispense with the other form, not mixing yet, just a reception by exaltation. For instance, if you had, let's say, Moon in Pisces, where Venus is exalted, while Venus is in Taurus, where the moon is exalted. Never mind that Venus owns Taurus, but Venus is in Taurus where the moon is exalted, and the moon is in Pisces where Venus is exalted. That would be an example of reception by exaltation. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about reception by signs ruled. So the example I gave earlier, Mars in Taurus, Venus in Aries, a simple reception involving sign rulership. We are not going to talk about any kind of three-way reception. Again, if you troll around the internet, you'll see on discussion boards people talking about things like, oh, I have Mars in Gemini, I have Mercury in Taurus, I have Venus in Aries. Those three planets own those three signs. So I guess they're in some form of three-way reception, says the neophyte. Alan says, no, there is no three-way. in mutual reception. We can't have circularity. What we need is just two planets. It's always a pair, each in the other's sign. And that's where the real work happens. We don't entertain mixed receptions. This would be an example if Moon is in Pisces, owned by Jupiter, while Jupiter is in Taurus, where the Moon is exalted. That would be an example of trying to mix rulership and exaltation. Where that is a class of reception, but I'm not doing that either. Okay, so let's move on. So let's see what William Lilly says about all this. He says reception occurs when two significators regarding any matter or question are in each other's dignity. So dignity, as we said, could be rulership, exaltation, triplicity, term, deacon. The only one we're going to address is planets, each in each other's sign. And this is the point that he makes in the second statement here. Reception of these two planets by sign is the best and the strongest of all receptions. Now, if you go out in the internet, reading here, there, and everywhere, you'll see pretty active discussions about mutual reception. And many say that, and this is based upon, some classic authors going back to the Arabic astrologers and astrologers of the medieval era, who are saying that mutual reception to be effective must have an aspect between the two planets. But you see Lilly, who basically consolidated all of this material that came before him and was the preeminent practitioner of horary. He says in this third statement, even without an aspect, if mutual reception happens, the thing is brought to pass. So basically he says that mutual reception is powerful to affect the matter in the horary question, or to bring about, to manifest the thing in the person's life, even if there is no aspect between the two planets involved. And we'll see examples of this as we get into it. So, I'll briefly dispense with this in terms of the math of mutual reception. We know there are 12 signs and 12 houses. But for any given ascendant, you cannot have some exchanges existing. Okay, picture this if you will. Oh, first I should say that we're doing this all from the perspective of traditional astrology, where the traditional rulerships are 7 planets ruling 12 houses, 12 signs. So in other words, there is no Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto in this scheme. So as far as Aquarius, it's the traditional rulership. Saturn is the Lord. As far as Scorpio, the ruler is not Pluto. It's the traditional ruler, Mars. As far as Pisces goes, it's not ruled by Neptune. Its traditional ruler is Jupiter. So for the 12 signs of the zodiac, we have the 7 classic planets ruling that zodiac. So, Sun owns Leo, Moon owns Cancer, Mars rules Aries and Scorpio, Venus rules Taurus and Libra, Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo, Jupiter rules Sagittarius and Pisces, Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius. That's it, that's all. So you can have 66 different combinations of house lord exchange. You can just walk your way through it. Lords of 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 1 and 4, 1 and 5, etc. Go around and then start with the second lord. Lord of 2 and 3, 2 and 4, 2 and 5, etc. around the chart like that until the last one is 11 and 12. You'll get 66. But in any given chart, there are a number that are excluded. Let me just give you an example. If you have Aries rising, there can be no exchange between lords of 1 and 8th house. Why? Because Aries owns both of them, Mars, Aries, and Scorpio. For similar reasons, in that same Aries rising chart, you can't have an exchange between the third and the sixth houses either, because Mercury rules them both and it can't exchange with itself. Okay, so there are those reasons where planets own two signs or houses and are therefore excluded, with certain ascendants from allowing exchanges. And then there are other, I won't get into it, there are other combinations which sometimes cannot occur simply for astronomical reasons. And those are in the minority, but let me move on. So in a nutshell, 43% of all charts have at least one mutual reception. 3% have two mutual receptions. And 0.03% have three mutual receptions. You might ask yourself, can there be four mutual receptions? No, because four mutual receptions would require four pairs of planets. That would make 8 planets. As I've already said, we only have 7 planets to work with. So that's why we max out at 3 mutual receptions possible in the chart. And this is exceedingly rare. Indira Gandhi is a famous example of that. And if somebody might just get a hold of her birth time, Greta Thunberg, the now famous Swedish teenager who's espousing environmental concerns for the world, she may have a mutual reception too, so long as she's born before 6 p.m. or 6:30 in the evening. Anyway, we'll see what happens with her. Let me move on. So there's a process, and let me walk you through this. And when we get to the example charts, of which I have several, you're going to see the methodology. So first things first, you look at a chart and you look for, and you're not going to find it all the time, of course, because it'll only be in 2 out of 5 charts. So 3 out of the 5 will not have a mutual reception, get over it. But 2 out of 5 will. So you go through the chart and looking for a pair of planets who simultaneously occupy each other's sign. Okay, this is pretty easy, and we'll see quickly enough when we get to some sample charts. We must then focus on the 2 houses that are owned and occupied by those 2 planets in mutual reception. Now, you know that many planets, let's say Mars owns Aries and Scorpio, while Saturn owns Capricorn and Aquarius. But if Mars and Saturn are in mutual exchange, they are in only 2 signs. Mars may be in Capricorn, let's say, and Saturn may be in Aries. So then Aries and Capricorn are the only 2 signs we now care about. And the 2 houses that they occupy are now the only 2 houses we care about, because that's where the 2 planets are. Even though Mars owns Scorpio, we don't care. Even though Saturn owns Aquarius, we don't care in that particular chart. We are concerned only with the 2 houses occupied by the planets in sign exchange. Okay, we'll see more of this when we get to examples. Then, once having identified that pair, we need to ask ourselves, is this mutual reception generally fortunate, unfortunate, or of a challenging nature? Now, this means nothing to you yet, because I haven't defined what do we mean by fortunate. Very simple rules, unfortunate and challenging. I'll get to that very quickly. This is just sort of big picture overview. Then the 4th step is interpret on the basis of the house themes that arise in light of this general outcome. So basically you're looking at 2 planets occupying 2 houses. Each house is associated with certain meanings in a life. You do your best to combine the notions of those 2 meanings in light of the outcome that you expect, fortunate or challenging. And again, we'll get to lots of examples to hopefully make this clear. So there's the process. First, identify a pair of planets who are in each other's signs. Then take careful note of the two houses that they occupy. That's your focus. Ignore the other signs that they, and then move on to decide, because of the relationship between the planets, or actually the houses that they occupy, you will know from this checklist I'm going to present whether this is going to be generally fortunate, unfortunate, or challenging. And then it is your challenge. Speaking of challenges, you need to have a pretty decent vocabulary around house meanings. And so everybody, has their own responsibility in this regard to either be able to reach out for a book that has, very full descriptions of what the houses mean. And eventually you've got to, commit this kind of thing to memory so that you can do it on the fly and interpret, live in front of somebody, something that is meaningful. That we're not going to be able to cover in this because it'll take too much time to walk through all the houses. But the general idea is that you need to have a command. Just as we have a command of the nature of planets, that Mars is hot and feisty and aggressive, whereas Jupiter is optimistic, philanthropic, and travel oriented. I mean, these are cliches, but you start with cliches and develop them as you can. So we have these associations with planets. We need to have the same breadth of association regarding house meanings as well too. Without that, you will struggle to create an interpretation. Okay, bear with me, we will get to this. So let's define fortunate. So, most people, I'll cut to the chase at the bottom, and well, not cutting to the chase, but go to something that's very obvious. For most people who've studied astrology for, any period of time, pretty much recognize that houses 6, 8, and 12 are troublesome, unfortunate, traumatic, problematic. Throw whatever adjective fits on the wall and see what sticks there. But we're all pretty much conditioned to know that houses 6, 8, and 12 are negative and therefore have some sort of unfortunate association. On the other hand, go to the top of the list here, and there's a so-called fortunate class. And go through this list: 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 10, and 11. And I can cherry pick out of this, and I can say, well, houses 1, 4, 7, and 10 are all the angular houses. Well, I think we can all agree that that's a good thing. They're sort of in a position of power. Or we could take a separate point of view and say houses 1, 5, and 9 are what we call the trinal houses, often associated with Dharma. Anybody who's read Alan Oken's books decades ago now, he talked about, this sort of categorization of Dharma houses 1, 5, and 9. And then added to that are houses 2 and 11, both associated with money, wealth, income, etc. So for the most part, we can all agree that these would appear to be positive houses, in contrast to 6, 8, and 12, which are pretty much universally deemed to be negative. So left in the middle here is the notion of the third house as being somewhat problematic or challenging. Now, admittedly, this is a notion that comes courtesy of Vedic astrology, and I've kind of transplanted it into this body of work now on mutual reception. But if we wanted to just test this notion, I don't know, we know that the 8th house is negative, and you can count the 8th house from the 8th becomes the 3rd, and that's why it is a bit of a kind of a watered down negative. The 8th house is often considered the most negative of houses, wherein accidents, surgeries, traumas, great misfortunes, bankruptcies, and all the rest of that, divorce, all these problematic things in life occur. The 8th from the 8th is the 3rd house, and that's why it's got this sort of, think of it as an echo or a shadow of a shadow. And this, well, you'll have to accept on faith, and we'll see how it plays out in actual interpretation. So when we view mutual reception, there is a bit of an uncertainty principle. I'm going to sort of move quickly through this because we're not going to use it that much. But basically, in your mind's eye, basically, you're going to look at a chart and see, well, the example I gave earlier, if Mars is in Taurus and Venus is in Aries, they are in each other's signs. And they could effectively, in our mind's eye, they could exchange places because they each belong back in their own sign. And when they are each in that situation being in the other sign, there's a kind of reciprocal sort of relationship that allows us in sort of in a virtual mode, that's why I say in our mind's eye, to allow them to flip positions and see them in the other sign, in their own sign. And in so doing, we could have them move from their own position and step directly into the, I'll call it a footprint of the other planet, assuming its degree position in the sign, or the planet could take its own degree position and transfer over to the other sign. So that's where we get a little uncertainty. You can do either or both and see what you see as a consequence of that. I'm not going to apply this technique too much in these examples. I just wanted to declare that you can do that. So once we affect a mutual reception in our mind's eye, the two planets end up, quote unquote, end up in their own sign. That's what mutual reception is all about. The ability to exchange places with another planet who's in your sign while you're in its sign. So effectively, we flip back into our own sign of rulership in our mind's eye. So post exchange, a planet, each of the pair always ends up in the sign that it owns. I mean, that's the definition of mutual reception. When the pair are each in each other's sign, and when they exchange, they'll end up in their own sign. So clearly, and that therein lies the value of mutual reception, because the planet ends up strong by being in its own sign after the exchange is effected. So certainly it has a positive outcome in that regard. But we can evaluate its dignity before it moves as well too. Earlier I gave the example if you have Mars and Saturn in exchange, where Mars is in Capricorn and Saturn is in Aries. Now, after they flip, they're each in each other's sign. But before they flip, what's the status? Mars is in Capricorn, where Mars is exalted. But Saturn is in Aries, where Saturn is debilitated. So they start off unequal. Mars is exalted, Saturn is debilitated, and then they flip, and then they end up each in their own sign. So the outcome is, acquiring their sign of rulership. But prior to the exchange, they start off in a different state. Now, I've used an example there where they were very different. One exalted, the other debilitated. Many mutual receptions start off from a neutral state for both planets and end up in their own signs. But before the exchange, it might have been, quite an ordinary status. But still, we take note of this because in my example of Mars and Saturn, it may give Mars the greater power because it started off strong and post-exchange, it ended strong. Saturn started off weak and post-exchange ended up strong in its own sign. But if you look at the before and after, Mars has got the greater power, the sum of its dignities before and after exchange. Okay, so let's talk about dignities. When are planets strong? So obviously after exchange, they end up in their own sign. But before exchange, they could be exalted, they could be retrograde, or they could have directional strength. Now, a lot of people say, well, retrograde, why are you putting that in there? Like, because I thought retrograde made a deficient planet of some sort. Well, again, this is an idea courtesy of Vedic astrology. And I do hope that more people will start to think of this. When a planet is retrograde, it is actually closer to the Earth than at any other time in its cycle. And because it's closer to the Earth, it appears brighter in the sky than in the average of its full cycle. And for that reason of visibility, it is accorded greater import. So in this scheme of things, we'll consider a retrograde planet being bright and more prominent, therefore stronger than normal, as opposed to, appearing to go backwards and therefore deficient. The notions of directional strength, this is, a notion from traditional astrology, not much used in modern astrology anymore. But Sun and Mars achieve directional strength in the 10th house, Moon and Venus in the 4th, Mercury and Jupiter in the 1st, and Saturn in the 7th. So, if one of those planets is in that position, before or after exchange, it gains some brownie points by virtue of directional strength. What is a weak planet? Well, we all know that a debilitated planet is weak. We all know that a combust planet is weak. Most accept that a planet that is eclipsed is also weak. What do we mean by eclipsed? An eclipse is happening, the planet is close to that, and therefore, obscured by the luminaries. Planetary war, again, a notion from Vedic astrology, and again, one that has, been touched upon a little bit in traditional astrology, but not really expounded. Planetary war exists when two planets are within 1 degree of each other. And it's sort of like crowding each other's space in the sky. And it creates a sort of the equivalent of a struggle in which, both are harmed to some degree. I don't think we're going to present any cases of this in today's examples, but just a point of note. And the moon, well, everybody knows the moon is strong, aside from being strong in its own sign or strong in sign of exaltation, separately by phase. The moon is strong when it's full or within one sign of being full. The sign before it achieves fullness, the sign after it has achieved fullness. So basically anywhere is from 165, wait a second, get my math right, 180 degrees, from 150 to 210 degrees away from the sun. Basically, the moon is strong. Meanwhile, a new moon is a weak moon, and a sign on either side of that is also a weak moon. So there's your dignities, and we assess the planets before and after exaltation just to get a sense of flavor. There's a notion of a control planet. I'm going to flip right through this and say basically we're not going to get into that in this presentation because it will take too much time. But sometimes to create nuance in an interpretation, you want to know which of the two planets in the exchange relationship will ultimately be the stronger of the two. In the case I alluded to earlier, Mars and Saturn, where Mars is exalted in Capricorn before exchange and then into Aries after exchange, while Saturn was in Aries, debilitated in Aries before exchange, and then in its own sign Capricorn after exchange. Clearly Mars has more brownie points in this before and after snapshot than does Saturn. That would be an example of a control planet, and therefore we would lend a bias to Mars in the interpretation of that exchange because of its dual virtues or its dual strengths before and after exchange. We would call it the control planet. Like I say, I won't get into that today. Okay, so maybe I'll just open this up very briefly for questions. Does anybody have any questions? Because I've just sort of gone through rolled out the basic theory. And if anyone's sort of left behind, confused about something or other, we could clear that up for you. And, as is typical for half a dozen other people who have the same question. So I'm not sure how this works,
Great.
Kaylin.
I'll just, I'm reading from the people asked some questions and I'm reading from the little chat box. So we had some questions at the beginning and a couple just popped up. So I'll just maybe start and then you let me know when you're done taking questions. Does that work?
Okay.
Okay.
Yep, go ahead.
First question, what about mutual reception planets by sign that are averse?
It doesn't matter. So long as the planets are each in each other's sign, the notion of aversion does not apply.
Okay, next one. Why not use the modern outer planets?
Because this is a system that has been in place for thousands of years in Vedic astrology, many centuries in traditional astrology, and no less an authority than Olivia Barclay, who's one of my case studies. And, Olivia Barclay is credited with, a renaissance in traditional astrology by virtue of her promoting William Lilly's books through republications and in her qualified horary practitioner course. She basically pounds the table and it says again and again and again, if you're going to do this, you're going to use traditional astrology, you're going to use the classic 7 planets to rule the 12 signs. You need no other. And she goes on even further to say, I have never, in my experience of looking at horary or natal charts, found a mutual reception between outer planets that is worth analyzing. So her point of view is stick with the classic 7 planets traditional rulership of the 12 signs. I mean, and she's not alone. It's just I happen to have that quote at my fingertips, and she is, or was, I should say, leading practitioner and advocate of traditional astrology.
Great. The next question is how important in the overall natal chart is mutual reception?
Okay, let me hold that thought just for a second and go back to say to the previous questioner, there's no problem in your entertaining the notion of mutual reception between you while using the new rulerships of the outer planets where Pluto owns Scorpio, Uranus owns Aquarius, and Pisces is owned by Neptune. You may do that, but don't expect the same results. Okay. Um, Back to the question. Sorry, repeat it, please, Kaylin. I
That's
did
okay.
forget.
They just want to know how important in the overall natal chart is mutual reception.
Okay, for 60% of charts, it won't matter because it won't exist in that chart. So that's a little bit like asking, how important is a grand trine? Well, if it's in a chart, it's there to be interpreted, right? So again, with mutual reception, if it's in the chart, it should be interpreted. But I did say something along these lines earlier. Don't expect mutual reception to provide the defining themes or the be-all, end-all prognosis of a person's life. It is, after all, only one factor. Um, there are many other things in the chart. They may have T-squares, grand trines, grand cross, you name it, 3 planets combust, all of which is worthy of serious analysis and commentary. So mutual reception, when it exists, should be interpreted the same as any other significant configuration in a chart.
Thank you. And then the next thing is that there's some confusion that a few people are asking kind of similar questions of the difference between um, when I'm like basically the difference between Vedic and classical astrology and the difference between whole house sign, like using the whole house sign versus the tropical Placidus chart. So there's a few questions like about, is mutual reception Vedic based? Can a tropical Placidus chart be used? Are you only working with whole houses? So I think there's a little bit of like, what's the difference between those, and can we use, um, you know, uh, more not like anything outside of the whole house system, I guess.
Yeah, good question. And I was remiss in not having addressed that whole issue at the outset. Okay, so originally I was a Western astrologer, obviously tropical zodiac, and through my studies with the Faculty of Astrological Studies, we got exposed to every house system under the sun, and of course, I experimented with them all. Having been introduced to Vedic astrology, as many people know, it's a sidereal zodiac whole sign house system. And to this day, it's now, having become convinced of the sidereal zodiac's merits, that is what I use. And the examples that you'll see today are using the sidereal zodiac. And the examples you'll see today are using whole sign house systems. So, but here's the thing. If you adamantly prefer to use the tropical zodiac, that's fine. Go right ahead and do that. Mutual reception still exists by the same rules. It'll still be just as common. You'll find mutual reception in 43% of all charts. None of that will change. It's just that the actual planets and houses in mutual reception may well be different. In some cases, they could be the same, but in other cases, they will often be different. Basically, my preference is using the sidereal zodiac, but I do recommend for whomever to do consider whole sign houses because it simplifies things. Picture an unequal house system. We have the notion of intercepted signs. So it could be that, let's say, you have a planet in mutual reception, in sign exchange, but that planet is in one of these intercepted signs somewheres within the third house, let's say. So then the quandary becomes, what's the key planet here? Is it the Lord of the third house cusp, or is it the planet that occupies the sign intercepted within the third house? And those are two different planets. The Lord of the third house cusp is one planet. The occupant of the third house is another planet. And then there's the other planet with which that planet enjoys an exchange. What if it's in an intercepted sign as well? Or what if it's not? What if it's in one of these signs? What if it's the Lord of a sign that straddles the cusps of two adjacent houses? That happens too. Confusion reigns then. How many houses are we looking at? Which houses do I use? And believe me, you don't want that confusion, because once you start considering more than two houses, you are definitely in trouble. That's the beauty of the whole sign house system. The whole of the sign is the whole of the house. So if the planet is in that sign, it's in that house, and that's it, that's all. And because there's, in a way, no real cuspal point, the sign is the house, then the Lord of that house is very unambiguous. It's the Lord of that sign, which constitutes the whole of that house. So it simplifies things beautifully. And believe me, you want to do that at the outset. I'd say experiment a while with a whole sign system before you even think of using unequal houses under the scheme of analysis for mutual reception. Okay, next.
Okay, great. Thank you. Do you think you want to continue taking questions, or maybe we should move
I think
on?
probably if you don't have anything else of significance, I mean, maybe you can judge if there's a pivotal question there or a common one. I can take another, but otherwise I should probably move on with, real live chart examples.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Okay, is the screen back on display? My screen, I guess. Oh, I guess
Yes,
by
your
my other
screen is
monitor, I
on.
see. So, here we have Sydney Omar. So Sydney Omar needs no introduction in the world of astrology, but, we'll introduce him anyway. Back in the 60s, he was trained as a journalist. He worked for United Press and CBS Hollywood, and he became a fixture in the Hollywood firmament. as an astrologer and as a media journalist. And of course, he became well acquainted with many significant, luminaries of the day, whether they were, actors or producers or, musicians and performers of one kind or another. So he went on basically to become a kind of a one-man industry in astrology. If you're old enough, you'll remember Sidney Omar's syndicated sun sign columns in probably whatever newspaper was major, in the era. Yeah, at one time, he was syndicated in 200 daily newspapers, which is quite phenomenal. And in his heyday, he was writing 13 books a year, sort of a sun sign prediction for each of the signs and another overall encompassing book for all signs together. And in the course of his career, he sold like over 50 million books, became a very wealthy man as a consequence of that. Even though he was known for, sun sign astrology via his syndicated column, he was in fact, an astute practicing astrologer who, used real astrology, not just sun sign astrology, to, for his many high profile clients. So he became not only famous, but, very wealthy doing what he did. So he has a mutual reception in his chart, which is one of the fortunate variety. So job number one, when faced with a chart that you're not familiar with, the first task is to find the mutual reception. And the way you start is just begin in the first house and say, is there a planet there? No. Move to the next house. There's a planet, Saturn. So Saturn is in Libra, the sign of Venus. So that means if there's to be a mutual reception, it's got to be with Venus. You go and check Venus and you say, is Venus in a sign owned by Saturn? No, it's in Gemini. Okay, so we can move on. There's no reception between Saturn and Venus. Next planet, South Node, skip it. Next planet, Jupiter, in Aquarius, owned traditionally by Saturn. But we've already seen Saturn is in the sign of Venus, so there's no exchange between Saturn and Jupiter. Next, Mars is in Aries. When a planet is in its own sign, there's no exchange. It's already there. Next planet, the moon. The moon is in Gemini, owned by Mercury. Let's go look for Mercury. Mercury is in Cancer, owned by the moon. Bingo. There's the mutual reception. Moon in Gemini, owned by Mercury. Mercury in Cancer, owned by Moon. What houses are these? 10th house and 11th house. So after we've dispensed with the planets and the signs, we almost don't care about the sign anymore. What we're now focused on are the two houses concerned, 10th house and 11th house. Now, notice that Mercury owns Gemini and it owns Virgo, but we don't care about Virgo because the moon is not there. If the moon was in Virgo, we'd have an exchange between house 1 and 11. But the moon is not in Virgo, so we don't care about Virgo at all. The moon is in Gemini, 10th house. Mercury's in Cancer, 11th house. So we have an exchange between the 10th and the 11th lords. Those were two of the positive houses. Remember the positive houses? 1, 4, 7, and 10. The triangle houses, 1, 5, 9, and two many houses, 2 and 11. So 10 and 11 are both positive houses. And so in Sidney Omar's case, then we have one of these fortunate mutual receptions between lords of 10 and 11. So then we look at them a little bit more closely. So we notice that Mercury is the ascendant lord. That kind of gives us more interest in this mutual reception, even though I said, look, I don't really care about that, but the ascendant lord is significant. It's square Saturn. We're just taking note of dignities now. The moon is dark. Notice that the sun is here. The moon is in the sign just before the sun, so that's a dark moon. It's with Venus. Okay, that's good. It's with Rahu, the North Node, not so good. What's the 10th house associated with? It's associated with one's career, one's social reputation, karma in the general sense of that which we do becomes that for which we become known. So, reputation, social accolades, position, honor, etc., etc. So that's the 10th house. The 11th house, one of the primary things is income, but it's also friends and associations, more abstractly, life's hopes and dreams. So 10th and 11th house are often entwined because the 10th house is the career activity, and the 11th is the second from it. So it's like the money that accrues or grows as a result of the 10th house activity. So this is a very good exchange to have, and it's what generated, this income for him in the media profile. So in terms of 10th house results, see, in our mind's eye, we flip these now, and we see Mercury in the 10th in Gemini. We see Moon in Cancer in the 11th, where they each, in our virtual mind's eye, occupy their own sign and therefore a position of strength. So 10th house results include things like, he became a media personality. Everybody knew his name. He became the face of pop astrology by virtue of his syndicated column. He basically became an industry of consulting and publishing in astrology. 11th house results. Volume of production, a prolific writer of syndicated columns and books, 50 million sold. And the whole notion of friends and associates and clubs and memberships and society, the strength of this house gave him a lot of connections in Hollywood and high society. So this is a very beneficial sort of circumstance. Now, it is entirely separate from other strong things that we might find in his chart. Just for instance, Mars, Lord of the 8th house in the 8th, might suggest to you a great command of occult wisdom, through study of, in his case, astrology and numerology. And that would be an interpretation point that you could talk about for a little bit. And it's supplementary or complementary to what we've seen through the mutual reception. So again, it bears repeating, mutual reception is not the be-all, end-all, definitive statement about who a person is or what they do. There are other factors in the chart that must be, analyzed, commented upon, integrated overall in the context of the chart that we see. So mutual reception is just a part, and there are other parts to the chart that have to be incorporated here as well too. It's interesting that the nodal axis runs through houses 4 and 10. And so no matter whether we leave the moon there or swap it over and bring the Mercury back, the two planets in exchange are in contact with the nodal axis, which is itself associated with mysteries, the hidden, the occult, shadowy things such as, astrology and other sort of arcane studies. And that the nodal axis ends up affecting both of the two exchange planets before and after exchange. Let's go to another case. So here's Olivia Barclay's chart. And again, let's go through the first part is just let's identify where the mutual exchange is. Starting in the first, we see Jupiter in Cancer owned by the moon. So then we go looking for the moon. And we see the moon, we want to see the moon in Sagittarius or Pisces in order to create that reciprocal relationship with Jupiter, but it is not. It's in Leo. Okay, so Jupiter has no mutual reception then. We move on to these two planets, and we've just dispensed with the moon. Well, maybe not. Let's look at the moon. Moon is in Leo, owned by the sun. So we go looking at the sun and say, it's in Scorpio. Okay, so that's not in a sign of Cancer. So there's no mutual reception between moon and sun. Go to Saturn. Saturn is in Leo, owned by the sun, but we've already seen that the sun is not in Saturn's sign, it's in Mars sign Scorpio. So there's no reception there with Jupiter, moon, or Saturn. Move on to Mars. Mars is in Virgo, owned by Mercury. Go looking for Mercury. Here's Mercury. Mercury is in Scorpio, owned by Mars. There's our mutual reception. Mars in Virgo, owned by Mercury. Mercury in Scorpio owned by Mars. They are each in each other's sign. And now that we've established the linkage by sign, we almost don't care about the sign anymore. Now what we're interested in are the houses, third house and fifth house, as declared down here. Just to dispense with the one straggler here, Venus in Libra, when a planet's in its own sign, it's not exchanging with anything, it's already home. So we're back to Mercury and Mars as being lords of 3 and 5 in exchange. So that's the key factor. So, we assess these. Mars in Virgo, that's an ordinary sign. It doesn't have any dignity. Mercury in Scorpio, that's also ordinary. It sits on the nodal axis, okay, of interest. What's the third house associated with? Well, now we might start encountering some things that are not so readily, coming to mind for the average Western astrologer. Third house is about, yes, writing, but it also rules the arts, science in general, technical skills of all kinds, especially things that you do with a hand that require craft work, that require expertise, that are developed through practice. Fifth house, I guess most will agree, kids, creativity, but less well known in Western astrology is the notion that the fifth house is the house of intellect. It's a house of spiritual practice. It's the house regarding study of scriptures. Okay, so if you accept all that, how do we make sense of this? Well, the third house then, so effectively post-exchange, Mercury ends up back in Virgo and Mars ends up in Scorpio. Like in our mind's eye, this is what happens under mutual reception. We allow the two planets to flip positions and thereby gain strength in the sign, which equals the house where they achieve their own domicile. So that creates strength then for the third house and the sixth. So the third house, arts and design capacity, writing skills, and a familiarity or ease or practice with rules and procedures. Now, Olivia Barclay was, a practicing astrologer back in the 60s. She became kind of disenchanted with what she perceived as an overly psychological bias to chart interpretation, which she felt was kind of getting a little bit too new agey, airy-fairy, abstract, no longer meaningful to the client. And she became more interested in a more traditional approach wherein, astrologers dealt with real things in people's lives, like lost cows or when will I get married and stuff like that. And so she absorbed William Lilly. She acquired republication rights to his, pivotal book, Christian Astrology, and kind of almost single-handedly revived traditional astrology in England in that era by virtue of making available those books of William Lilly, and also starting the Qualified Horary Practitioner course, the QHP course, which many, well-known astrologers of today have taken that course, or did take that course with her because she's now dead, and became very well known, through their own expertise. First through horary practice and then through more broadly based traditional astrology applications. So traditional astrology, and especially horary, is very much rules based. I mean, William Lilly lays all this out to a significant degree. And that's good because we need clarity when it comes to knowing how to interpret things. And so she basically formalized this to a great deal in her coursework and in the book that she subsequently published, Horary Astrology Rediscovered. And for those of you who don't have that book, I highly recommend it because it still stands as an excellent example of guidebook for the practice of horary astrology. The fifth house, study of scriptures. Well, in this context, William Lilly was the guru of yesteryear whose scripture, Christian astrology, she inhaled, absorbed, digested, integrated, and subsequently gained, the publication rights to, produce it and make it more widely available. Her capacity, fifth house's capacity to teach, which she did through her QHP course. And games and parties, that's another fifth house association. Well, it's not well known that she was, a designer. She was very much kind of a card shark, loved to play games. In her day, she did design an astrological board game, which never went into production, and only the board survives to this day, according to one of her former students that I got in touch with. Um, uh, but that was one of her great passions. I was trying to remember some of the names of some of her students. Deborah Holding is one, of course, who's quite well known within um, uh, traditional astrology. And boy, the name escapes me now. John something or other, who's a famous horary practitioner of British origins. Anyway, so with third and fifth house strength being generated by the mutual reception that happens between these two, this created, benefits. However, somebody might be saying, well, didn't you say that this is a challenging sort of aspect as well, or pattern? Yes, indeed it is. And her challenge was that, she was frustrated in some of what she did. She never really quite succeeded in making traditional astrology, preeminent above, what I'll loosely call a New Age or psychological astrology. Her board game never got produced, and she had other frustrations in her personal life. She died of cancer around the turn of the century, and I was not able to find out the cause of her death, although I do suspect that I know that she was a smoker, and I therefore believe that lung cancer was quite possibly the end of her. And why would I go to that in where are the reasons for that in the chart? Well, the third house is the bronchial area, and Mars is a malefic, pure and simple, in the third house. That's one thing. Then Mercury is the lord of the third, and Mercury is here in association with two malefics. The sun is one malefic, and the nodal axis is another. And the nodes in particular are very much associated with, mysterious and wasting diseases such as cancer. So, that may be scant evidence, but that is one prognosis that we could draw from that. I mean, Mercury in and of itself, aside from being the third lord, specifically for a Cancer rising chart, Mercury is also what we call a generic indicator for the lungs as well anyway. So this Mercury gets, sort of smacked twice, if you like, by the presence of two malefics, and its role is both third lord and generic indicator for the lungs. I won't get into this, but Olivia Barclay is one of these curious charts that has what we call a draconic bowl. Notice the nodal axis that runs through the chart, divides the chart in two, leaves half the chart occupied with planets and the other half of the chart empty. This is the very definition of a draconic bowl. This is a type 4 draconic bowl where a planet, in this case two planets, Mercury and Sun, has gone beyond that nodal axis, but still remains within the same sign. And that creates problems as well too. And back to bronchia, lungs, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, enough on her case. Let's move to another. Dane Rudhyar. So most people will be saying, Dane Rudhyar, unfortunate, huh? Are you serious? Dane Rudhyar is quite famous. How could you deem him to be unfortunate? And this is where I remind everyone that it's an unfortunate pattern, this particular combination of a planetary exchange, but it is not the be-all and end-all of everything in Dane Rudhyar's life. It will comment on certain aspects of his life, and those aspects we might well deem to be unfortunate, but there are other qualities or aspects of his life that we might score very highly for quite separate astrological reasons, for reasons other than this mutual reception. Okay, first things first, let's find it. So we started in the first house looking for a planet. There's no planet there, just the ascendant. Nothing in the second, nothing in the third. In the fourth, we have Moon and Mercury in Aquarius. So we'd be looking for Saturn, who is the Lord of Aquarius, to be in either Cancer, the sign of the Moon, or Gemini or Virgo, the sign of Mercury. So flip around the chart and there's Saturn, but it's in the sign of Venus. So no mutual reception exists between Moon, Mercury, either of Moon, Mercury with Saturn, because they are not in each other's signs. Move on. Sun in Pisces. Well, that's owned not by Neptune, but by Jupiter in traditional rulership. We go looking for Jupiter. Here's Jupiter here in the 8th house. It's in the sign of Gemini. That's not the sign of the sun, so no mutual reception exists between Sun and Jupiter. Move on to the next planet. Venus in Aries, owned by Mars. So we go looking for Mars. There's Mars in Taurus, owned by Venus. Excuse me, bingo. Venus and Mars are in mutual reception. Lords of 6 and 7. Okay, are we finished? We looked at Jupiter already, we looked at Saturn already, so we are done with the other planets. So our focus now resides upon this Venus and this Mars in houses 6 and 7. So why is this deemed to be unfortunate? Well, because it involves an exchange of the 6th, the 8th, or the 12th lord. Remember, we said that any house lord exchanging with a lord of 6, 8, or 12 was problematic or unfortunate. And why? That's because of a traditional association of houses 6, 8, and 12 with miserable circumstances of some kind. Look, we know 6, 8, and 12 own other things than the miserable, but they do have a bit of that connotation or reputation. And if you know enough word associations that you can apply house by house by house, you can come up with quite a few negatives when discussing the 6th and the 8th and the 12th. Okay, so accept that this is an unfortunate one. So what's going on here actually? The Lord of the 7th, Venus, has gone to the 6th, while the Lord of the 6th, Mars, has gone to the 7th. So there's a kind of a negative symbiotic relationship here going on between the 6th and the 7th. So we like to, take a cursory look at the two component planets, and we say, well, Mars is the ascendant lord. It's ordinary in Taurus, meaning it has no particular dignity. Venus, the other planet, it's ordinary in Aries, and the only thing going on with it, aspecting is it's directly opposite Saturn. So that's it. That's all about those two planets. What is the 6th house about? It's about one's health. It's about job, employment. It's about competition of all kinds. 7th house is about partners, the public, and foreign places. So, what do we know about Dane Rudhyar's life? Well, he was a French-American astrologer who graduated from the Sorbonne, the famous university in Paris, at age 16 with a degree in philosophy, age 16. It's a bit of a prodigy. So he's very much involved in the artistic milieu of Paris of the day. And around that era, he had an epiphany where he saw the interconnectedness of all things with respect to the cyclic nature of time. And he became fascinated by astrology, theosophy, Eastern religion, Jungian psychology. And he began to study the stuff and eventually to write about many of these things, and was considered a modern Renaissance man by virtue of his command to express himself in music, painting, writing, philosophy. He wrote for many national magazines. He emigrated to the US sometime in the 30s or before World War II. and gained a name for himself in both the literary, in the astrology, and musical world. And he was the pioneer of what we would maybe call today modern transpersonal astrology. Maybe the very thing that Olivia Barclay didn't like, I don't know. He's best known for his book, The Astrology of Personality. And who among us with a bit of history in astrology did not have most or all of Dane Rudhyar's books, along with, others of the day? So he became one of the most respected astrologers of the 20th century. Now, that's all very positive. In terms of the negative, do we know anything about him? Well, here's one little factoid. He was a great admirer of smart and beautiful women, to such a degree that he was married 5 times. And right here in this exchange between 6 and 7, astrologically, this is virtually the kiss of death for a happy monogamous relationship. I'm going to chuckle and say, like, please don't take me like literally, absolutely in every case, because somebody out there listening may have this, and I don't want you to start worrying overnight about your own marriage. But it is a troublesome sign, in the absence of other mitigating factors. So here's why. When the 7th Lord goes to any negative house, 6, 8, or 12, it's a bad sign. But when it goes to the 6th house, which is, yes, the 6th house, which is bad in and of itself, but from the perspective of the 7th house, the 6th house is 12 houses away. It's doubly negative. So for the Lord of the 7th to go to the 6th is bad once because it's the 6th house, and it's bad twice because it's the 12th from the 7th. The 12th from anything reflects the loss of that thing. So if your mom is the 4th house and the Lord of the 4th is in the 3rd, that sort of like presages a loss of the mother. Well, in the natural order of things, our mom's supposed to die before us because she's 20 years old or more. But, anyway, this is just a general rule. Well, let me not go on with other examples. Let's just stick with this. So an exchange between the 6th and the 7th is very problematic for a relationship. So married and divorced, married 5 times, divorced 4 times, I guess. So is that a good life or not? Well, it implies some degree of difficulty, and certainly not unmitigated happiness in the realm of relationships. At least somebody wasn't happy. So the 7th house includes, rules are significant others for sure in the context of, significant other in an intimate relationship. But when we think of the other, and if we choose to capitalize that and broaden the context, the other can mean other things. If I am me, the 1st house, the other, represented by the 7th, represents anybody else who's not me. If I'm a consulting astrologer, the 1st house represents me. The 7th house, in this case, represents the other, represents my clients. If I'm Taylor Swift, a world famous recording artist, and the ascendant will represent me, the other, as represented by the 7th house, might very well be my multitude of adoring fans. So the 7th house can be the other, which is representative of a whole slew of other people, both intimate, personal, significant in terms of business partner, recurring in terms of consultant client relationships, or abstract in the case of star and their adoring fans. So there's different ways to look at the 7th house, but for the moment we'll just say that it's all of those things. 6th house indicates the health, the job, the competition. 7th house, partners, public, foreign places. So how did this play out in his life? So 6th house results, multiple marital separations, the dislocation of the 7th house by virtue of 7th Lord having gone to the 6th, which is the 12th from the 7th. Very problematic for relationships. So marital problems, unstable health, loss of kidney. So this is not well known, of course, but He lost a kidney at a fairly young age and lived most of his life. I think it happened in his 20s or before he was 30, and so lived the majority of his life with one kidney only. Incidentally, in the chart, the seventh house is the place of the kidney, and quite separate from that, Venus is the generic indicator of kidneys. So here we have both the seventh lord and Venus, which we could treat separately. Here, coincidentally, they are one and the same, are both in the sixth and aspected by Saturn, which often reflects a loss or suffering of something. And then there's this notion of no clientele. Whoa, who knew about this? In his lifetime, Dane Rudhyar saw scarcely a handful of clients. He was not a consulting astrologer. He was a theoretical astrologer whose fame rested on his books, his lectures, yes, and simply his publications. But he was not a consulting astrologer, except in very rare occasions. So, if you treat the seventh house as clients, the seventh was not well served by virtue of there being virtually none. And perhaps it was, an area in which he did not feel competent, or he had no desire, or for whatever reason, we can't read the man's mind, but he was not a consulting astrologer. He had virtually no clientele. Seventh house results, I said earlier, that seventh house reflects travel as well, because if the first house is the here and now, the seventh house directly opposite from in the chart is the over there and the then. It's the opposite of the present circumstance. So it reflects crossing the street, and it also reflects going around the world or going to another place. So his immigration, was part of this seventh house effect. And the seventh house, of course, is working with others. And so he did achieve a, highly regarded psychological approach to astrology, and on which, his fame still rests to a great deal. Okay, that took me so much longer than I thought to go through all these examples. And I think I'm supposed to wrap it up in 5 minutes or so. So Kaylin, maybe I should go back to questions for
Yeah,
any kind of tidying up loose ends.
sure. Sounds great. So let's see. Um,
Just while you're deliberating on that,
okay.
hang on a sec. I'm just going to put my very last page up on the screen for anybody who's interested in this particular subject. They should take a look at this particular book, which goes into all of this in great detail.
Great. So
I'm
we
sorry, you go ahead.
oh
Yeah.
no, you're okay. So someone wanted to ask to clarify between the more modern idea of the ninth house as foreign places versus the seventh house as foreign places.
That's fine, and I didn't mean to exclude the ninth house as a potentially foreign place. Basically, for distant travels, you can look at the seventh for the obvious reasons that is opposite to the here and now of the first. The ninth house has always been traditionally associated with longer journeys, especially in the name of education, for higher studies. People often had to go somewhere else to do that. But the 12th house is also associated with foreign places too. More often they're associated with sort of foreign pilgrimage or retreat into ashram kind of circumstances. So actually houses 7, 9, and 12 are all reflective of travel. But certainly I didn't mean to exclude the ninth, just that the seventh is one of the key that was brought up in this particular point.
Great. And somebody wanted to know, okay, so if there is, let's say there's someone's basically asking about what if there is a mutual exchange in like one system and not in another. How do you like, I guess the exact question is, for Dan, tropically there is a mutual exchange of the fourth and seventh lord, question mark. So I think that they're asking like, how do you
They're asking
decipher?
about the, okay,
Sorry,
they're
go ahead.
asking about their own chart.
No, they're asking about Dan. Is it tropically there is a mutual exchange of the fourth and seventh lord?
In which chart? In a hypothetical chart.
Um, I'm not entirely sure. They may be, maybe.
Okay, well, let me cut to a broader answer for a broader question. You have to choose your system. I alluded earlier saying that, in a full study of Western astrology, there are so many house systems to choose from. I mean, do you want Porphyry, Placidus, Cock, Equal, what am I forgetting? Regimentanus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are many. And as anybody who's played around with these knows that depending on which you choose, you may displace a planet from second house to third, or from seventh to eighth, depending on your choice of house system. You have to decide what you're going to use. I'm recommending using a sidereal zodiac. I'm recommending using a whole sign house system. Please feel free to experiment with tropical, not experiment, to stay with the tropical zodiac with which many Western astrologers or most Western astrologers are familiar. But please do explore whole sign houses because it simplifies the whole matter of who rules this house and who occupies this house. It just dispenses with a whole chunk of confusion because with unequal house systems, intercepted signs or signs straddling the cusps of two adjacent houses, you're creating questions for yourself that you cannot resolve or not resolve easily. Whole sign houses dispense with all of that and make it simple for the neophyte to cut their teeth on some basic analysis, without which it becomes very difficult.
Okay, great. And I just want to say, okay, so the next thing is, let's see. Would the 12th to first concept in mutual reception apply to all mutual reception planets by sign in adjacent houses?
So I think if the person is saying what I was saying, if the 12th away from any particular focus house is what's in exchange, then that is problematic. Let me find some sort of a semi-neutral. Okay, so many people will ask, for instance, when am I going to retire? So one can ask oneself the question, retire from what? Retire from your career. Career is the 10th house. The retirement from it might be the 12th away, the 9th. So if you had a mutual exchange between 9 and 10, the analysis of those two planets might give you a clue as to when you might retire from that career, because we're defining the 10th house as indicative career. Somebody else might say a modified question is like, when am I going to get another job? They're not talking about retiring, they're talking about job change. A job, employment, is indicated by the 6th house. The loss of, or reversal of, or the negation of the employment is the 5th house because it's 12 away from the 6th. So to make this clear, it's whatever is your point of focus. And in this case, I'm now choosing to say employment is the focus, employment's the 6th, loss of employment will be the 5th because it's 12 away. So then, if mutual reception exists between lords of 5 and 6, you have the seed of job loss and job change because the lords of 5 and 6 are exchanging. And those two planets will then provide clues depending on what system you are using, whether it's something from Vedic astrology, as I would do, or whether you're using progressions, or whether you're using transits of the lords of those two particular houses. That may give you the clue as to when that job change may occur. So the answer to the questioner is that yes, you can apply this 12 away concept to any focal house in the chart.
Okay, great. Thank you. And the last thing is, before we close, is I made an error in mispronouncing Dane's name. Am I
Oh, I
pronouncing it
see.
correctly? So that's why there was
Dane Rudhyar.
confusion about who this person was talking about. But I feel like, so he's asking for his chart. Tropically, there is mutual exchange of fourth and seventh lord. But I
Yes,
feel like
because
kind of, yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, because there's no 4-7 exchange in Dane Rudhyar. It's only the 6-7 exchange. So now the person's asking for an interpretation of their chart. So, well, I'm just not going to go there.
Yeah,
It is productive. I'll say this much because it involves two positive houses. They're both angular houses. Fourth and the seventh are two angular houses, and involving education, partnership. Look, here's a fly off the cuff kind of thing. Um, you know, um, Significant involvements with a significant other in the course of education, real estate transactions, or vehicular movement. Why do I go to those things? The seventh house is obviously a significant other. The fourth house rules education. The fourth house rules real estate. The fourth house rules, what did I say? Vehicles. So you can construe some sort of a positive association somehow among those, but it is positive because in exchange of two angular lords. And then it's, back to the nature of the two planets and what else is going on with them, where you try to tease out more meaning.